If people like you, they'll listen to you. If they trust you, they'll do business with you. Let's jump right into this explainer with that quote from Zig Ziglar, because it totally sets the stage for what we're digging into today. Influence, at its absolute core, is all about engineering trust. But man, what happens when that absolute mastery of building trust is used to completely betray it? The setup and the sting, deconstructing the straight line. Today, we're objectively dissecting a wild duality. We're going to look at the brilliantly effective psychological framework of Jordan Belfort's sales system and contrast it with the brutal reality of how it was criminally weaponized. We'll be bouncing between two very different sources: the actual Straight Line Persuasion training manual and a deeply insightful Reddit breakdown of the exact financial crimes that were committed.
All right, here's our roadmap. First, the straight line system. 2, cracking the 3 10s. 3, deflecting and looping strategies. 4, the pump and dump. And finally, 5, weaponizing psychological tactics. We are moving straight from the high-minded concepts of persuasion right into the mechanics of the white-collar crimes that brought the whole house of cards down. Let's get to it.
Section 1, the straight line system. Before we get anywhere near the fraud, we have to understand the foundational psychology that actually made it all possible. So the official straight line persuasion system essentially treats a prospect's mind exactly like a high-tech combination lock. The idea is that if you punch in the right numbers in the exact right sequence, you'll literally hear a click. The safe swings open, and boom, the client buys. It's this incredibly mechanical, almost clinical approach to human behavior. And the core premise here is just fascinating. The straight line isn't just some catchy marketing name. It literally represents the shortest distance between opening a conversation and closing the deal. The system dictates that absolutely every single word, phrase, and question you ask has one singular goal: moving your prospect directly down this line to increase their certainty. Honestly, if you aren't building certainty, you're off the line.
Which brings us to Section 2, cracking the 3 10s. The crucial point here is understanding exactly what beliefs we need to align in the buyer's mind. Like, what actually are those numbers on the combination lock?
Well, before you even think about spinning the dial, the manual drops this crazy psychological fact. It takes only a quarter of a second, 0.25 seconds, for a prospect to make an initial judgment about you. That is practically instantaneous, and it makes those very first moments absolutely critical for establishing the baseline trust you need to even start selling. Once you actually have their ear, you've got to hit what they call the 3 10s. According to the system, a sale only happens when absolute certainty is reached on a 1 to 10 scale across 3 very distinct elements. 10 out of 10, they have to absolutely love the product. 10 out of 10, they must trust you implicitly. And 10 out of 10, they have to trust the company you represent. If any of these are sitting at, say, a 5, what the manual calls sitting on the fence, they just won't buy. But here's the thing. It's not just about facts and figures. The manual stresses that people ultimately buy on emotion, and then they justify that decision with logic. That means you have to trigger both types of certainty to close a deal. You definitely need logical certainty, which is driven by the specific words and hard facts you present. But you also desperately need emotional certainty, that gut-level internal crazing that tells the buyer they just have to have this. Now, even with all 3 10s totally maxed out, you still face what's called the action threshold. This is the invisible barrier a prospect has to cross to actually hand over their hard-earned money. And to push a difficult buyer over this threshold, the system relies on a fascinating and, kind of dark psychological lever: pain. The manual literally teaches that pain is the most powerful motivator to create urgency, pushing people away from their current discomfort and right into the solution you happen to be selling. Let's move to Section 3, deflecting and looping strategies. Because let's be real for a second. What happens when the prospect inevitably says no, or let me think about it? As they say, the sale doesn't actually begin until the prospect says no. This brings us to probably the most famous part of the system: deflection and looping. Think about it. Rather than launching a full frontal assault on an objection, which, just makes the buyer put their guard up, you calmly put the objection aside. You deflect it. Then you loop backward in your presentation to rebuild their certainty in you, the company, and the product. It's honestly an incredibly elegant way to maintain total control of the conversation. Listen to how the recommended script handles this. When a client says, "Let me think about it," you reply with something like, "I hear what you were saying, but let me ask you a question. Does the idea make sense to you?" Do you see what happened there?
It shifts the focus entirely back to whether the core idea logically makes sense. You aren't arguing. You're just gently guiding them right back to the straight line. Then, once deflected, you immediately use the next pattern to loop back. You say, and let me say this, the true beauty of the program is, and you tighten your pitch. Crucially, the manual really stresses using a disarming tonality here, rather than aggressive certainty. You want to sound reasonable, like you really care. That lowers their defenses so you can pitch those benefits all over again.
And this is where it gets incredibly psychological. If they are still stalling, you drop this metaphorical script. If I had been your broker for the past 3 years, making you money, you wouldn't be saying, let me think about it. This completely forces the client to admit the real issue isn't the product at all. It's a lack of trust in you, the broker. By dragging that out into the open, the salesperson can directly address that fear, rebuild the relationship, and spike that second 10, their trust in the salesperson.
All right, now we pivot to section 4, the pump and dump. We've seen just how brilliant the psychology is. But to understand the Reddit analysis of the crimes, we have to look at how these highly effective psychological tools were used to commit massive white-collar crimes. According to the Reddit breakdown, this is the legal reality of what the brokerage was actually doing behind the scenes of those brilliant sales scripts. It's called securities fraud. They weren't just aggressively selling good stocks. They were actively misleading average everyday people into buying total junk stocks to artificially inflate their value. This step-by-step breakdown clearly illustrates the mechanical fraud. Step 1, insiders buy dirt-cheap junk stocks in total secrecy. Step 2, the brokers use the straight line system to pump the stock, basically hyping it up to outside victims. Step 3, once the price skyrockets from that artificial demand, the insiders dump their shares at the peak. And Step 4, the stock crashes, leaving the victims holding totally worthless shares. The straight line wasn't just a sales tactic here. It was the literal engine required to execute Step 2 of this criminal enterprise. To put the sheer scale of this into perspective, Reddit contributors pointed out that by investing a mere $10,000 into 1 million shares of practically worthless penny stocks, the pump phase could drive prices up to, say, $3 a share. Guys, that turns 10 grand into $3 million. It created massive illegal profits for the insiders at the direct expense of the exact clients they were supposed to be advising. Finally, Section 5. Weaponizing psychological tactics. So, how did the psychology of the straight line actually keep victims trapped in this financial scheme? Like, why didn't they just realize it was a bad deal and get out? It's a really great question. If the stock goes up, why couldn't victims just sell their shares and cash out? Well, partly because this was before the internet, so real-time stock values were completely hidden from the average person. They only saw delayed tickers in the newspaper. But the real trap? It wasn't technological at all. It was entirely psychological. A quote from one of the Reddit contributors perfectly captures the dark side of looping and deflection. They noted that the only way to sell your stock was to go through the exact same charismatic guy who sold it to you in the first place. So when victims realized they needed the money or wanted to cash out, they had to call their broker. And when they asked to sell, they were immediately hit with those exact language patterns. I hear what you're saying, but does the idea make sense? The true beauty of holding this stock is they were looped and deflected into keeping their money in the system until the dump happened, leaving them completely holding the bag. When we juxtapose the official manual's focus on integrity against the Reddit breakdown of the actual fraud, the contrast is just stark. It's undeniable. The system preaches building trust and fulfilling the client's needs. The criminal reality was insider trading and market manipulation. As one Reddit user perfectly described it, it was like polishing pieces of worthless flint and using high-pressure sales to convince poor schmucks they were buying diamonds. Which brings us to the ultimate question. The straight line system relies on undisputed truths of human psychology, our need for trust, our emotional cravings, our vulnerability to pain. Are these powerful tools of persuasion fundamentally broken, or just waiting for the right or wrong hands to wield them? We'll leave you with this final thought. The combination lock of human psychology can always be picked, but the ultimate outcome depends entirely on who is holding the safe open. Thanks for hanging out with us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.